I was telling Scott, I was talking to him, and I said, Scott, what are you doing the Lord's Supper on? He said, adversity. And I said, that's the very thing that I'm going to be preaching about this morning. I said, I've seen this happen so many times. God just weaves things together. You don't have to plan them. God's going to weave them together. How many of you have seen the movie The Sound of Music? Raise your hands. Oh, okay, lots of you. I'm not outdated. That was 1965 when that came out. You remember that scene where Julie Andrews is standing in the mountain meadow, and she's surrounded by the beautiful Austrian Alps with their snow-capped peaks, and she's spinning around, and she sings this. The hills are alive with the sound of music, with songs they have sung 1,000 years. The hills fill my heart with the sound of music. That's all I know. Yeah, I know I can't sing. All right. But what I wanted to do, that scene, it shows her spinning around, and she is just full of life. Life is great. Life is wonderful. I'm inspired by the mountains. Of all the places I've ever lived, the only thing I ever really miss are the mountains. They're inspiring. You just get up, and we used to walk out of our house in Laramie and look over at the snowy range, and it was just inspiring. Or go up into the mountains, just inspiring. That phrase that the mountaintop experience, isn't that what we all aspire to? We want that mountaintop experience. We want that special thing that just tells us life is good. I want a great marriage. I want great children that love me and I love them. I want a good job. Sorry, Scott. I want a good job. I want to reach a great career. All of these, I want my health to be great. I want that mountaintop experience. We all aspire to that. Somebody said, all sun creates a desert. It does. If that's all you have is sun, it creates a desert. What happens? Now, I don't know of anybody that lives their life without having some adversity. David called it the valley of the shadow of death. And that's what it is many times. It varies in intensity, but sometimes it's overwhelming. But somebody told me one time, they said, what if you lived your whole life on the mountaintop? What would your relationship to God be like? More than likely, it would be a matter of producing pride and independence. And a person would say, I don't need anybody, I don't need anything, and I certainly don't need God. I think that's what that would lead to. But there's another side to life, and that's what I want to talk about this morning. I want to talk about the difficulty of life. Life is hard. Life can be very hard. Now, if you haven't lived long enough to understand that, you will. You will go into the valley of the shadow of death at some point in your life. I guarantee you will, and probably many times. It's what you do with it that makes a difference. The valley of the shadow of death. I want to talk just a little bit here. I want to go through some things because I think we tend to push this out of our mind. We don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about adversity. We want to talk about the happy things, the positive things, and that's fine. And we should aspire to those things. That's great. But there's another side to life that unless we're in tune with how the world is a sin-cursed place. Thank you, Adam and Eve. And there's a lot of adversity in our world. A lot. There's adversity in this room. And in my experience through the years and going and serving at different churches, in every church there's adversity, there's drama. In the world there's drama. In our families there's drama. But I want to talk about some specific things here. And what I talk about here, you may say, well, that doesn't apply to me. I don't even expect that to happen to me. But I want to talk about some of the things that people live with. And I'll use some personal examples, and I'll also use some examples from the people that I've known through the years. First, there are health issues. I have a friend of mine in his early 60s, maybe late 50s. He's out riding his bicycle. He is very good at eating what he should eat, and he's exercising the way he should exercise. He's taking care of himself. And he feels a pain in his left arm, and he has indigestion, and he gets back home, and it goes away. The next day it comes back, and his wife says, he tells his wife, and his wife says, "You've got to go to the doctor." And of course, as a man, he says, "No, I don't need to go to the doctor." And the wife insists, "You've got to go to the doctor." And so he goes, and he finds out that he's got a blockage in one of his arteries, in several of his arteries. And he thinks to himself, well, I'll just have one of those stents put in. It's just a one-day operation, and I'm out, and there's no real problem with it. And the doctor says, "No, we can't use a stent on your condition. Your arteries are so blocked, we're going to have to do open heart surgery." You know what that means? It means they crack open the chest and pull it apart and work on your heart. That's months of rehab. Those things happen to us. Cancer. One of the scariest words in the world is cancer. Some of us, many of us perhaps, will have cancer at some time in our lifetime. In 2018, Angie had cancer, Kay had cancer, and I had cancer. And Kay, when visiting the hospital with me, slipped on a floor that they didn't warn her that had been mopped, and she broke her arm. 2018 was a hellacious year, and one I don't want to repeat. We were in the valley of the shadow of death. And thank goodness we had many of you who helped us out, brought food in. Anna provided transportation to doctor's appointments because none of us could drive. We were incapacitated in that way. Those things happen. Old age. Now, a lot of you can't identify with this. You're not there yet. You will be there shortly, let me tell you. You will be there shortly, faster than you want to be. And you know, the golden years, there are wonderful things about the golden years. I love it. But there's also things that, well, there's also things that are bad about the golden years. For some of us, the first time we start to really think about our mortality. I'm not planning 10 years ahead or 15 years ahead or what career I'm going into. I'm at the end of my life as I get older. It's a descent into helplessness. If you live long enough, you will be like the Apostle Peter. Someone will have to guide you and take you maybe where you don't even want to go. Old age, that's mortality. And one out of every one of us is going to die. That's a wonderful thought. Chronic diseases. Many of us live with chronic diseases. Some of you, diabetes. That's a cloud over your life in many ways. Diabetes, lupus, sickle cell, multiple sclerosis, all kinds of different chronic diseases that people have to live with every day. I can't imagine. I'm not at that point in my life, but I can't imagine that. Alzheimer's. More and more people are getting Alzheimer's. Kay's mother died with Alzheimer's. Her dad went in one day, and she was sitting on the side of the bed, and she was crying. And he didn't know what she was crying for, but he looked back on it. Her mother died. Kay's mother's mother died of Alzheimer's, and I think she knew that something was terribly wrong, that she was drifting into that. Our first notice of it, she sent us some Christmas presents to the girls who were grown at the time, and we opened them up, and they were doll clothes, and she had sent them for the girls to wear, and we thought, what in the world is going on? This woman, she has all of us son-in-laws loved her. We never made any mother-in-law jokes because we loved her so much. She was a vivacious, wonderful Christian woman. And to watch her get to the point where she couldn't recall the names of her children. She couldn't recognize her husband. And she became combative, and finally she was just a blank slate mentally. That's going to happen in our lives. And not only that, but the people that have that, there's people around them that are also going to have to sacrifice. Caretakers. Caretaking is a sacrifice. We need to hold up the arms of those that go through that in any form. Mental illness. Many people have bipolar. Clinical depression. You don't even feel like getting out of bed. Schizophrenia and so forth. Drug addiction. I think one of the greatest slaveries in our world today is drug addiction. And if you've been with anybody that's had that, I went through, in my graduate work, I did what they call clinical training, and I went over to observe how they treated alcoholics and how they treated the mentally ill. And the stories are beyond belief, and especially in the area of addiction. People will give up their babies. They will lie, cheat, and steal. They will turn on the people that love them the most to get that fix. And they have nothing but compassion for somebody that goes through that and for the people around them that suffer from it. It's one of the realities of our world. There's financial pressures. You're working in a job that you never intended to do. When you were thinking in your younger days, you were thinking about what I want to do with my life, and you find yourself in a job that you don't really want to do. Somebody said Sunday night is one of the worst times of the week because Sunday night is when you're thinking about you got to go to work Monday morning. And especially if you don't like the job that you're in. The loss of a job. We had a very vivid illustration of that in Scott. And his attitude toward it will blend in with some of the things I'm going to say about how you handle it. That's a valley of the shadow of death when you're used to working and providing for your family, and you go through that loss of job. And some of you have been through that. Not making enough to make ends meet. More and more Americans are finding that they're having trouble getting from paycheck to paycheck. And that might be you. You might have to decide between whether you're going to eat or you're going to have your medicine. That's a difficult thing. And a lot of people are in that situation. And in the world, poverty is common, but it's becoming more common in our country. Can't make ends meet. Hopeless indebtedness. People get themselves into terrible situations. Credit cards are now regularly 22%. When I was younger, that was called usury. You could go to jail for charging somebody those interest rates. Today it's common. Some pay as much as 29% interest, and because it was just raised, it's going to go up higher. If you're paying a mortgage, it's going to go up. If you have a credit card, it's going to go up. In Texas, we have a little creature called an antlion. And the antlion will dig an inverted pyramid into the soil, a hole, but it's shaped like a pyramid upside down. And the ant will come along and he'll tumble into that pyramid, into that hole. And he'll try to climb back out, and the sand just gives way underneath his feet, and then the antlion comes up and gets him. Easy to get in, hard to get out. And that's what indebtedness is. They ought to have a warning on credit cards. This can ruin your life and your happiness. And yet we're sending those, companies send them to our college students who really are not equipped many times to deal with what they're going to be having to deal with. It's a terrible situation. Budget busters. Everybody have those? And the other day, I bought a Honda. Last few years, I've bought Hondas and Toyotas. And the reason I do is they're reliable. When Kay and I were first married, in the first years of our marriage, we had our cross-your-finger cars. We hoped that it would start. And if it started, we hoped we could get to where we're going. I wanted something I could rely on, and so I chose Hondas. I had a Honda that had 240,000 miles on it, and it ran as good as the day I bought it. I'm a Honda man, Toyota man. But I went out the other day to start my Honda. It only has 40,000 miles on it. I hit the start button, and the engine starts, and it sounds like there are about two cylinders going. I can't remember it. But it was a sad sound. And all the lights on my dash were lit up. And so I did what every normal mechanic would do. I lifted the hood, and that was the extent of what I could do. But I lifted the hood. I said, is there anything obvious here? There wasn't. I had to have it towed. And they called me from the Honda place. I was thinking, oh, this cost $200 or $300. He called and he said, you know, we've seen this before, but we think a squirrel got under your engine and chewed your engine harness in two. That'll be $1,500. Angie said, Dad, you ought to try and see if the insurance will cover you that. I don't think they will, but I call them. They did, $800. Budget busters, you don't expect them. You should expect them. They're going to come one way or the other. Those are some of the things that we have to deal with. Broken dreams. When we are young and we're thinking about what we want to do with our life, we have a dream about what we're going to do with our life and how it's going to go. And sometimes those dreams don't come true. I remember very vividly, we moved to Boston. I severed my support from the Churches of Christ in Kansas, and so we had to grab jobs just to put food on the table. I had two girls in high school, soon to be in college, and I did a paper route. I did a telemarketing job selling newspapers, whatever we could do to make and put food on the table. We were going to stay in Boston. And one day we're walking in the park, and we're holding hands. Kay and I love to walk in the park and just spend time talking to each other. And she starts crying. And she says, Greg, we don't have a house. We sold our house in Kansas. We've used that money. We don't have a retirement plan. You're 45 years old, and we don't really have anything as we go into the future. Broken dreams. I never dreamed that I would be in that situation. I wanted to be in the ministry. I wanted to be on the staff of the Boston church. But I wasn't on the staff for 13 years. I did a lot of leading in different ways, but I was never full-time staff. Your dreams get crushed. That's another part of the adversities that we find. The death of a loved one. Everybody that's married here, you or your husband, or you and your wife, one of you is going to die first. A widow or a widower. All of us are going to go through that. It's a devastating thing, as you can well imagine. But we're going to go through it, some of us. A child dies. You think, that could never happen. That could never happen. Our 15-month-old son, Matthew, choked to death. Kay was out in the country trying to drive home, and he began to choke, and she stopped and did everything she could. He died in her arms. That's the valley of the shadow of death. Devastating. Those things can happen in our lives. A mother or father dies. It's interesting. My mother and father died within a couple of weeks of each other. And we were supporting them. We were helping them financially. But there was something unusual. There was something about both of them being gone that I'm a grown man. I haven't depended on them for a long, long time. But I felt part of the security was gone that I'd known all my life, that mom and dad are there in the background. And it's a strange feeling. We're going to experience that. Marriage issues. Marriage is hard. Marriage issues, constant fighting and turmoil, constant tension, hostility, cursing, name-calling, or just living in silence with one another. That's a terrible way to live. It's terrible on the kids. It's terrible on the marriage. An unfaithful spouse. I knew a person who was a part of the Boston ministry and was out of the ministry at the time. The woman was having some symptoms. She went to the doctor. The doctor said, you have a venereal disease. And she thought, I've known no one but my husband. Find out her husband's consorting with prostitutes. Unfaithfulness, broken trust. If you break trust in your marriage, it is so hard to get back. And only a few people can do it. You don't want to break trust in your marriage. You ever walked along a lake and run across an empty turtle shell? The turtle's long gone, just the shell. somebody coined the phrase empty shell marriage. It's the marriage where there is no cherishing, there's no connection, there's no love, there's no life in that marriage. Oh, they're still together. Those things happen. Divorce. You remember, some of you who are older, you remember when we used to brag about there had been no divorces in the churches of Christ. No divorces. We don't do that. Yeah, we do. We were just prideful enough to think after 20 years we had it all down straight. No, there have been divorces, and it's painful. And it's especially painful when a Christian marriage ends. Those things happen. Marital abuse, physical abuse. I've known numerous times where men have abused their wives physically, hitting them. And on one occasion, a wife hitting her husband and abusing him. Emotional, psychological abuse. There's children issues. You find out that your child thinks they're gay, or they find out that they are gay. There's a family, elder in the church, great family, and just an absolute picturesque family. If you wanted to talk about parenting, you called on this couple, and you went to them and said, come and teach us what you're doing, because you have done such a good job. And one of their boys, when he grew up, he married a girl who was from another elder's family, just exemplary family, raised in the church, and they get married. In a few years, the girl decides she wants to be a man, transgender, and the boy is some kind of fluidity, whatever, I don't know what, but both of them gave themselves different names. And those families, you talk about a shock. Those things happen. A child born with lifelong disabilities, those things happen. And we know some heroes that have children that have those lifelong disabilities, faithful to God. School difficulties, criminal activity, your child's arrested or incarcerated. Suicide, a child commits suicide or an adult commits suicide. Clash of teens with their parents, which is we almost call it normal. But it's going to happen from time to time. Well, those are just a few things. There's so many other things. I won't spend any more time on that. You're probably depressed enough. But that is life. That is life. And if you don't know that that's life, you're going to be shocked when things happen to you. How can that possibly happen to me? It happens to everybody in one form or another. That doesn't make it any less painful, but it's just a fact. The Apostle Paul, let's get this some scripture here. The Apostle Paul said, whatever you have learned from me or that I've taught you or that you've observed about my life, put it into practice, and it will bless your life. And so I want to look at Paul for just a moment. Is there anybody that you would consider a stronger Christian, committed Christian outside of Christ and his devotion to God than the Apostle Paul? Nobody. And yet, look what Paul went through. Listen to this passage here, 2 Corinthians 1, verses 8 through 11. We don't want you to be unaware, brothers, of the afflictions we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we'd received the sentence of death. This is the Apostle Paul. When he was in that state, he wasn't writing, rejoice, rejoice in the Lord. He was undergoing something that was so crushing, so overwhelming, he didn't think he could deal with it. But then he goes on and he says this, but that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we've set our hope that he will deliver us again. We get much help in prayer, that so many of you give thanks on our behalf for the blessings granted us through the prayers of many. One of the things I see in these passages we're going to look at, Paul asked the question, what am I learning from my adversity? What am I learning? That's a school in and of itself. If you have adversity, Are you learning anything from it? Paul says, I learned to rely on God. Well, what in the world does that mean, to rely on God? You may have a better idea of that than I do, but here's what comes to my mind. When something happens to us, there are some things about it that we cannot change. No amount of tears, no amount of wringing the hands, no amount of effort will change it. And yet we'll keep on wrestling with it and fighting with it and using our wits to try to deal with it. Paul, if I understand what Paul is saying, is he surrendered. I expect God to deliver me. I expect God to do something about it, but I'm going to rely on God. I'm going to do what I have to do, but I'm going to rely on God. My faith is in God. And that's what Scott was basically saying about himself this morning. You know what? This is a real blow, but it's bringing me closer to God. Our adversity can bring us closer to God. Somebody said to me some years ago, they said, you know, you Christians, Christianity is just a crutch for you. And I thought to myself, you know, there's some truth to that. Because we realize our need for God. And this guy talking to me hadn't yet understood, you're going to need God too. We've just discovered that we do need God, and we need to have a dependence upon God. And then there's another passage, there's many, but Paul describes, in Corinth, there were people that didn't like Paul. They thought he was a lesser apostle. And some of them in Corinth thought they were just as good as Paul. And Paul had to address that. He said, I feel crazy doing this. I don't want to do it, but I'm going to tell you, you're not equal to me. And he says this. He says, I'm talking like a madman. Are you servants of Christ? I'm a better one. With far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from the Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger in the sea, danger from false brothers, and hardship through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food and cold and exposure. And apart from all these other things, there's the daily pressure on my anxiety for the church. I mean, 1 or 2 of those things would send me in a corner sucking my thumb. When it says he was beaten 5 times, you have to go back and read what the Mishnah has to say about how that was done. They would strip them and put them between 2 pillars, and they used a whip that would first hit the back, and it was long enough that it would come down, and it was supposed to hit at least above the navel. And so they're getting cut 2 ways. And then they turn you around and do the other side. Paul said, I've been through that 5 times. I was stoned. You ever had a rock hit you? Imagine rocks to put you to death. And Paul was left for dead. And what did he do? He got up and walked back into the city. It's amazing what this man did. Adrift at sea. You know, I've been out on the ocean. I've been in a storm on the ocean in a small boat. It's scary. But the idea of drifting in the sea for a day, and especially at night, I can't imagine how fearful that would be. Paul said, I've experienced that. I've been in danger. I've been hungry, all of these things. And here's the question that if I were Paul, I would ask, God, don't you know that I'm serving you? Why would you allow this to happen to me? And that's what we ask sometimes when things hit. Why me? I don't understand. I'm trying to be a good person. I'm trying to serve you, and I'm going through all this. Well, what was happening? What did that do with Paul? It made him so strong, so resilient, so committed and dependent upon God. There was nothing going to stop that man. Adversity will have one of two effects on it. It'll crush us, or we'll learn from it and use it. You know, the cross was meant to crush God's purposes, but God used it as the greatest blessing. And sometimes adversities feel like they're meant to crush us, but it may be, in hindsight and with some perspective, it may be a good thing that happened to us in order that we might depend more on God. One other passage that I want to look at, and that's a passage where Paul talks about what do you do when God doesn't deliver you? What if you're looking for God to deliver you from something and he doesn't do it? Paul says this. Paul had been, what he says essentially is, I went into heaven. I was allowed to see heaven, and I couldn't express to you what I saw. I was in the presence of God. Now, when somebody experiences something like that, that's a source of great pride. And I think that Paul probably battled with pride because he was an exemplary man. And yet, he says, so to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given to me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it would leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. And therefore I will boast all the more gladly for my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, I'm content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. For when I'm weak, I'm strong. This word for thorn is a word that can also be translated stake. In the ancient world, one of the ways that capital punishment was established was a person was put on a stake from the bottom of the person up through their thoracic cavity. I can't imagine such a way to die. That's a strong word, this thorn. I think about a little prick. Paul has got something, and he's pleading with God. You ever plead? Begging. Probably crying out to God, please take this away. And God says, no. This is going, in your weakness, you're made strong, Paul. You're strong. And Paul says, if that's what it does, then I'll celebrate my weaknesses and the things that I go through. We aspire to the mountaintop. We want those mountaintop, and that's great. That's good. We'll have them, hopefully. But we need to also be aware of the adversities that can strike and how we deal with those adversities. It'll make all the difference. Does it bring you closer and more dependent upon God? Or does it crush you? That's the difference. In Philippians chapter 4, 4 through 7, the Apostle Paul writes, he's an old man, if you consider 65 old. I have a hard time considering that old, but 65, he was an older man. He's been through so much. And he writes this. He's in jail. He's imprisoned. He's a prisoner. Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I'll say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication and thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. This man who's been through so much rejoices in the Lord and says to his fellow Christians, rejoice in the Lord. Let him handle the things that you can't handle. I want to close with the last refrain from that song, The Sound of Music, and I'm not going to sing it. It says, I go to the hills when my heart is lonely. I know I will bear what I've heard before. My heart will be blessed with the sound of music, and I'll sing once more. I'm going to Christianize it. I go to my God when my heart is hurting. I know I will bear what I've heard before. My heart will be blessed with the sound of God's word and with his help. And I know that I will sing once more. Whatever you're going through, you will sing once more. If not in this life, in the life to come. Amen.